everyone, I'm Nikki Gamble from Just Imagine, and thank you for joining us for another author chat. I've got an amazing lineup today. I'm so excited to be introducing three wonderful graphic novel artists and authors. But first of all, let's have a big hello from everybody.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
And just so that you know, two of our guests today are joining us from the US, Sylvie and Jerry. And Thomas is almost as far away. He's joining us from Cornwall. So it's lovely to have you here. There are lots of points of connections between your books that we're going to talk about today, but equally huge differences as well. Jerry, your book, New Kid, I think is your first book in this series, is the only book to win the Newbery Medal, the Kirkus Award, and also the Coretta Scott King Award.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, we're talking today about the third book in this series, which is called School Trip. So we've got New Kid, Class Act, and School Trip.
Right.
Sylvie, your graphic novel is a memoir. We might call it a coming of age story. And Thomas, we know you as an illustrator of children's books, the very popular Baby Aliens series written by Pamela Butchart, but now this new perfectly formed little series of books for children, say from about 5 upwards, which would fit into this category, if you like, of graphic novel, or some people might call them first chapter books. They all have a very different look and feel about them, and yet they are all called graphic novels or comics. So I want to start with some opening questions, really. And the first one is to find out a little bit more about whether you yourselves were readers of comics, of graphic novels when you were growing up. And I thought I might come to Sylvie first, because I know you have a French background and they're not as backward as we are. It's taken us a long time to catch on in the UK to comics, but not so in France, I think.
I grew up reading comics. It was a normal thing in the house. There were a lot of books of all kinds, and they were Tintin and Asterix were just floating around, and everybody was looking at them, including my dad. Not my mom. She had no interest in reading this way, but my dad really loved them. And I grew up at a time when both Asterix and Tintin would come up with a new one every so often, and it was a celebration. We couldn't wait to get the new one. So that was a lot of fun. So yeah, reading in that form is very comfortable for me. But I think people here have caught up. I mean, in America, I just love the graphic novel scene right now that's happening here. So I think it took a little while, but we're not behind at all anymore.
So in France, they're called bande dessinée, aren't they?
Very good. Bande dessinée means drawn strip. And interestingly, people don't even think of what the acronym stands for. We just say BD or BD, which
Right.
sounds a little funny when I say it with English letters, but because it sounds like bidet. But anyway, it doesn't matter. BD means bande dessinée, drawn strip, and it just means anything, any kind of material that you read with images, really.
And an absolutely huge festival in France at Angoulême as well for the graphic novels. And just anecdotally, I recall years ago being invited to meet Goscinny and Uderzo in Paris. And they had the Arc de Triomphe was lit up with the characters of Asterix. Can you imagine them doing that with Buckingham Palace or Marble Arch? I just can't imagine.
That is amazing.
Anyway, Jerry, what about you? Were you a reader?
Yeah, almost only comics. I went from Dr. Seuss as a kid to Marvel Comics, and then nothing. There was no book that I really remember as a kid that I enjoyed reading. Anything but comics was kind of a chore. I never saw myself. They were too big. They didn't have illustrations. I was kind of a visual, kid where sometimes even certain comic strips, if I would look at, and it would just have so much text on it, it would just, it would look grayed out, you know,
Mm.
and it just shut me down completely.
Mm.
And even with some of the comics, I think I would go past some of the boring stuff and go right to the fight scenes,
Right.
So yeah, it really was a struggle at some point to read, but I did enjoy creating them and I did enjoy writing and drawing my own.
That's interesting because most of the people that I talk to, and a lot of illustrators who don't necessarily make graphic novels, but they will often talk about comics being really important in their formative years, and that part of that was making and drawing them as well, that went hand in hand with the
Mhm.
readings. So interesting to hear you say that. People assume that they're easier to read. Not necessarily, are they?
No, I heard someone mention in the sense that graphic novels use sometimes even a more complex vocabulary because when you've only got that much space, you need to make sure that every word counts.
Mm.
So you go for the most descriptive words that may take the place of three or four different words. So for people who think that, because it's a comic book, that it is a lower literary form, that is not always necessarily the case.
Mm. And I think the word that we use with English grammar about cohesion, about how one sentence links to another, if you don't know how a graphic novel works, you can get stuck on how one scene relates to another. I think there's quite a lot of course, the learning is something that you do through reading them. You don't always have to be taught these things, but nevertheless, you do have to pick up that language, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the pushbacks that teachers and librarians had, like, older teachers and librarians, because if they didn't grow up reading comics, that they themselves were a little confused with, which panel to read first and which order to read the balloons.
Mm.
So the ones that have taken the time to learn, and work with a kid who will show them, you know,
Mm. Mm.
um, have really crossed over. Like, wow, I didn't know what I was missing. Whilst there are still some that just shut down the whole art form.
Mm. And I am interested. I do happen to know Sylvie and Jerry. You're around the same age as me. Thomas is a youngster compared to us. And I'm just interested whether, Jerry, you were the sort of Marvel DC Thompson. Was that the sort of thing that you were reading?
Yeah, I was mainly Marvel, so Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Silver Surfer, that kind of thing. And
Mm.
even the vocabulary with that in each Marvel comic, it was the uncanny X-Men, the macabre man thing, and every issue was Armageddon and annihilation, and he was an archaeologist. So those are words I had to look up in the dictionary because obviously there was no Google back in the
Mm.
day. I couldn't just ask Siri.
Mm.
So it really did formulate my vocabulary to a certain level. So by the time I had to read, William Faulkner or James Joyce, I could read it. I didn't want to, but I was able.
Yeah, I was definitely on the Marvel side as well. And the Silver Surfer, what a character! So weird. I absolutely loved.
Me
I
too.
love that story and the Mighty Thor. But I had to just, anecdotally again. I used to have to steal these comics from my brother because they were bought for him, not for me, and he kept them under his bed. And you were lucky in the States, I think, probably because you could get these comics in sequence. Sometimes there would be a whole, you know, episode missing and we'd have to go
Oh,
back
really?
because we just didn't get them as frequently as we would have liked to.
Yeah, we
But
had Captain Britain that every once in a while I would see a Captain Britain, and I thought that that was pretty cool because I didn't see those often.
Ah, right. There we go. What about you, Thomas? What were you growing up with? Comics?
Well, when I was a kid, it was any books with pictures I loved, and that included comics definitely. Especially for me, it was Asterix. I used to get all the Asterix books out of the library, and I got disappointed when I run out of new ones. But the trouble I had was I loved Asterix, but I never connected with superhero comics. And whenever I went looking for something a little bit different, that was all I could find. So I kind of fell off books in general, really, when they stopped being illustrated for me. And then definitely when I got into video games. Then when through video games I got into Japanese stuff, in particular manga, and then that brought me back into the comic shops. And then I discovered sort of in my late teens that there was so many different things that comics could be, and that's when they got their hooks into me. I mean, most of the books behind me in my bookshelves are graphic novels that I've bought over the years, and it's mostly what I read nowadays. Like I try not to just read them, but if I'm being honest, I don't think I've read a non-graphic novel for a long time. But when I was a kid, it was Asterix I loved, but I just never found something else that got its hooks into me. I don't know why Tintin missed me. And I can remember I loved the Tintin cartoon that was on TV when I was a kid, but I only had a couple of those books. But yeah, it was in my late teens when I really discovered them.
And Sylvia, I have to say that Asterix translated into English, we had a particularly fantastic translator who worked on those.
I read both Tintin and Asterix in English, and I am amazed at the translations. I find that the wit of the English translation for all those names is actually superior sometimes to the French words. So, because the names, as you all know, the names in Asterix, they all are puns. And the English puns are excellent. I'm very impressed.
Yeah. The Romans in Britain. It's one of my favourites of all time, and I'm glad that you brought in the Japanese there, Thomas, because I noticed that your favourite film is from Studio Ghibli as well. So lots of connections between film and graphic novels, I think.
Definitely. I mean, especially I find with manga where they tend to have less words than Western comics. It's almost like an animation, but you flow from screen image to image, and it's like an animation. I think there's definitely it's not a delineated difference between the two. I think comics and film and books are all kind of entwined in a certain way.
We're sort of moving fluidly between these terms, graphic novel and comic. You know, some people prefer one and some people prefer the other. And what's already evident from your discussion is just how diverse this collection of books is. So much so that I don't know that we can really call it a genre, because you said, Thomas, you know, I enjoyed reading this, but I didn't enjoy reading that. I couldn't find this. So there's no such thing, I think, as a graphic novel reader, because the chances are it's a very different reader who'll be reading Sylvie's memoir, maybe to, you know, your Spider-Man, or I don't know. What do you think? Is it a useful term even to group this collection of books together?
I think it's definitely, it's like saying you enjoy reading books. It's such a broad term. I think there's certain topics that will interest other people and certain books will match people. But I think definitely nowadays there's such a broad range of things available. Like every book can be quite different to the next, and so I think it's a helpful term to delineate between a prose text and something which is illustrated. But I think it's so broad that it's like when you look there's only a small bookshop in town and they have a graphic novel section, and the range of books in this small section is quite staggering, really. There's fiction mixed in with science fiction and fantasy. And I think especially as it's got more popular, it definitely isn't as helpful maybe to put everything under the same term.
Interesting. I don't know if Sylvie or Jerry, if you have any thoughts on that.
The way I see it is that, to me, graphic novels is a form of expression, the way a movie is a form of expression, or poetry is a form of expression. So I think just like anything visual or prose, it covers all genres, like Thomas was saying, from memoir to fiction to nonfiction, historical fiction, anything can go into graphic novel. I think the idea is that it's expressing any kind of content through images and words, because we do have the bubbles and a little narration occasionally. So I like to use the idea that it's a form or style of expression.
I think that's really useful. Sorry, Jerry.
No, I have friends that whenever I use the term genre, they corrected me and said it's a format, not a genre.
Yes.
So that's what I go for, because I don't want to get in trouble anymore.
I mean, I asked that question for a practical reason as well, not just, to debate terms and things. I think it's important, particularly if you have, librarians or teachers who are not readers of this material themselves, to understand that diversity, and that, different kinds of readers might be interested in certain aspects of graphic novels, rather than to pigeonhole them and think that this is for this group of readers. So I think that that's the reason behind me asking that question. So one more, and then we're going to delve into these books, which I can't wait for. And that is, it's evident that Sylvie's memoir draws on her own childhood experience. But as I was reading all of your work, I suddenly felt that probably that was true for all of you, actually. So, Thomas, I'm guessing that you played with a Game Boy, for instance.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I first started writing the Press Start books, the very first version of the main boy was pretty much just me. And it was only when I decided to kind of move away from it just being me that the character kind of developed. But the starting point was definitely from my own experience. And so it's not a direct translation of my childhood, but it draws constantly. It's the main source of inspiration for each story comes from my experiences being a kid playing video games and an adult playing video games as well. So definitely not a direct version of me, but it's a massive influences my history playing games and the stories that I thought could come out of that.
And the aesthetic as well. It's not today's video game, is it? It's the video game of Nintendo and that world.
It's definitely. I was quite lucky, really, because for me, it's just Nintendo is what video games are. But luckily for the audience I'm aiming at, they have Minecraft, which has a very similar blocky look. So I think when a lot of kids look at it, because most games beyond Minecraft look very different. But I think luckily it's my little inroad into it being a little bit relevant still, that I use very old-fashioned graphics for the video game world.
I understand, having a son who's a game designer, that pixels are very much in, showing the pixelation of things is fashionable. So,
definitely.
Jerry, do you the content of your books, New Kid, Class Act, and School Trip, are you pulling on your own childhood experiences too for those?
Oh, absolutely. New Kid in particular is loosely based on my life and my two sons' lives. Specifically with me, I always wanted to be a cartoonist. And my mom and dad did not want me to be an artist because they had only ever heard the term starving artist. So they didn't think that you could ever make a living. And so I did grow up in a predominantly African American neighborhood. So each day I had to take the bus from One World all the way up to Riverdale, where it was just completely different economically, socially, like it couldn't be more different. And to go back and forth between that each day, I thought was kind of an interesting story that I hadn't really seen. Definitely not in graphic novel format. And then as I was a dad, I got to see my sons kind of navigate that same difficult terrain. So I got it from my life personally, having lived it, and then my two sons as a dad watching them.
Sylvia, yours is more explicitly. I mean, that's what it is about. But I wondered whether in the process of creating that and drawing on memory, whether you recovered lots of memory through that process.
Definitely. My first idea was to write a book of fiction. I was thinking I was going to write about a young girl growing up in France and just drawing from my French background. And then as I went, I realized I didn't have, and I thought I will just make up what I can't remember, or I will make up when it's boring. And then as I went, I realized I was not making up anything. I was really sticking to anecdotes I kept remembering. And I was very surprised to find out that an anecdote would trigger a memory of another one and another one and another one. And if every once in a while I remembered a strong emotion, but not really the anecdote that went with it. So I tried to remember what triggered that emotion, and somehow the anecdote came along. So I was very surprised, and that I really was sticking to reality more than I thought I was going to. And at some point the question came. It was actually late in the game. It was already submitted to agent, to editors, and the question came late in the game: is this a memoir or is this fiction? And I was calling it fictional memoir, and that just didn't seem to pan out too well. So I thought about it for a while, and I realized this is a memoir. I can't shy away from it. It's really me all along, and we went for it. In fact, it wasn't even called Sylvie for the longest time. The child was called Lisette, and it gave me a sort of distance from that. I think I would have found it very hard to think of writing about me. A little self-centered, maybe. I grew up in an atmosphere where you had to be modest and discreet and not talk about yourself so much. So by calling my character Lisette, I thought it was somebody else. And it's only at the very end that we just switched all the Lisette to Sylvie, and even called the book Sylvie. It was a bit of a almost embarrassing for me to call my book Sylvie. And now I'm completely happy with it because I actually like my name. So that works out.
Well, it's a wonderful book. We're going to look at some of it in a moment. Well, I'm going to talk to Thomas first for a little while, and then I will pick up with Sylvie and then Jerry, and then everybody's going to come back together at the end. So I think I started with you, Thomas, because the books are the youngest. I think that was the way round. And it's interesting because I think this age group hasn't had much graphic novel material, but it seems to be coming. You know, we've got Bumble and Snug and various other things, and of course your books. Tell us first of all, then, a little bit about them.
Well, it's I was invited by Scholastic in America to write a series of books based on video games. It was actually based on I'd done a puzzle book in the UK that had made its way over there, and it had a little section where about these characters designing a video game, and you had to join the dots to design the character. And they really liked, one of the editors really liked that and thought it had potential. And so we developed, we even took the same character. Super Rubber Boy first appeared in this dot-to-dot puzzle, and we brought it across to make this series of books about a boy called Sonny, who every book starts playing a video game, and then the story unfolds. And kind of you see him playing, and then you see the video game, and it kind of connects. And I try and make it interesting the way the two connect. Like they're completely separate worlds, but obviously the boy playing the game affects the game, and so I tried to find a way to represent the two different worlds, and that's kind of where the more comic-y stuff came in. Like the world of the real life world with Sunny is completely comics. There's no narration or prose text at all, and then to differentiate that, it gets into there's little bits of sentencing, but then there's speech bubbles as well. And so it's a series about playing video games, but I wanted to draw, like I said earlier, I wanted to draw from my experience of what it's like to play video games, because I did find definitely as a kid, most of the books that were about video games were clearly written by people that didn't really play them. and it always rubbed me up the wrong way a little bit. So I wanted to really bring into have video game characters, but have the experience of being a gamer and a kid with playing the game to kind of affect everything. It sounds more complicated than it is, I think, but having the two worlds definitely is a strong part of what I think works for the series.
We're going to have a look at some of the spreads inside. So here we are. This is from your book. So you're working on a tablet. I don't know whether Jerry and Sylvie do as well. We'll find out. But you work on a tablet and create this.
Yeah, I've got a big Cintiq, so it's like a massive iPad, and I just draw. I draw completely digitally now, but it's all done by hand, but using like a pen on a screen. I just find it suits me down. As soon as I started using digital, it really suited me. Before that, I was brushing ink and I was forever smudging everything.
Right, and it's interesting that as well. All three of you do your own words and images. That's not always the case. Sometimes somebody's writing, and particularly the older comics that we've talked about, the writing and the illustration and the colouring would have all been done differently. So you do your own colouring, your own writing, your own illustration.
Yeah, it's all me. Well, and the editorial team, obviously, and the designers, and so it's all done by my hand, but with a lot of help from the publisher. But it's the way I used to work before I did this as a job. I used to make little photocopied comics and zines, and everything was done like I used to work a page at a time. The idea of it now that I do proper books, where I plan everything in advance. I used to write a page, and then while I was inking it, I'd think what was going to happen on the next page. But it was nice returning to this because for years I'd been an illustrator on some really enjoyable books that I'd not written, but I enjoyed doing the pictures. But it was nice to return to kind of being in charge of the words and the pictures.
As you've already told us, these have been out in the States for a while, and they're just coming. Well, February they started appearing here in the UK.
Yeah, I think books 1 and 2 are out now. Book 3 is coming over here, I think, in the next few weeks. Whereas in America, I'm currently finishing at book 14 at the minute, so there's a bit of catching up to do. But it was really nice. The first time I actually saw one in the bookshop was earlier this year, and it was really nice to actually be able to do that, even though in terms of my schedule, I'm quite far into the series. So it's really exciting. And the publisher Nosy Crow I've worked with on Pamela Butchart's books for years, and so I think we've found a good home for them in the UK.
Brilliant. Can I just ask, it's not so much about creating graphic novels, but it's about publishing for, the different audiences in the US and the UK. Did you find that was different? Have these books been written with a US audience in mind?
I don't think specifically. I think there's only occasional spelling that came up. My spelling's atrocious anyway, so there would always need to be changes. But and not that I noticed. There's nothing I don't think there's anything in it that will stand out to UK audiences that having been written originally for the US audience. But I think I know that there's a few spelling changes. But apart from that, I think because it is drawn from my experience, I think hopefully it's quite universal. But it definitely didn't feel too different working with a US publisher for a change.
Interesting. So obviously I asked you to select some spreads so that we could talk about different aspects of your work. And the one thing that strikes me here is obviously the distinction between these two worlds, this brightly coloured gaming world on the one side and the family playing the game on the other.
Yeah, it was really important when I was developing the series that very easily the children that read it can tell the difference between which world they're in. So I really wanted it to have, whereas the video game world, everything's kind of blocky, and even though it's not rigidly right angles, it's everything's squared off. So when I designed all the kids and their parents, I wanted as many curves and circles as possible to soften it. And from that developed, when I was writing it, was the idea of having very different visual styles. So this is why I chose this spread. The page on the left is a real world where everything's kind of everything's comic and there's no narration. Whereas in the video game world, you do get comic panels, but there's lines of text in between. And I try and write them as if Sonny's imagining this story. In the prose text is what he's imagining as he's playing. So the two worlds are completely distinct. The video game world doesn't ever refer to what's happening outside. But I visually, I wanted there to be a really clear difference between the two.
Let's have a look at the other spreads here.
So this is, most of the story does happen with Super Rabbit Boy's adventures in the video game. So I chose this one as quite a good example of what a typical spread in the series looks like. So it flows between text and images and which one's kind of pushing the story forward. This is actually from a book 13, I think. So this will be a while before this one makes it to the UK. But I thought it was a pretty good example of how you can use the image to tell the story when it's action-based, and then the text to kind of fill in the gaps and to push things forward when it's less action-based.
Interesting. Jerry was talking about going quickly to the action pages when he was talking earlier. I used to like those, and the big splash pages that you got with so much going on.
I think if there's a reader that wanted to just get to the action, they could pretty much just go from picture to picture with the press start books, and then hopefully there's enough to draw them into reading the text. But if they just want the action, it's all in the pictures.
I love this. That's my colour scheme.
This is one of my favourite spreads, which is why I chose this. Particularly the colours. I wanted something because everything's published in CMYK, and so I just used the yellow, the blue, the magenta, and the black for this one. But I chose this. This is, for me, one of the best examples of why using pictures to push the story forward when the text can't. This is what I often do when there's a new scene, where I do a big double-page spread or a big full image where you can really set the scene visually, and it saves you so much writing. Kind of to describe this scene in text would take up a chunk of time, but it offers the opportunity to, on this spread, you've got the scene being set that they've just arrived in. You've got the prose in the bottom left, which you read first to kind of establish what's happened, and then the dialogue in the speech bubbles is what kind of pushes things forward to the next scene. And so I felt like this is a really nice example of what I enjoy about using like a more comic-y format, because when I started writing these books, I didn't necessarily have in mind I'm writing a comic book. I just kind of kept drawing more and more influence from the fact that that's what I enjoy making. And so when it was first described as being a comic book, it kind of surprised me a little bit. And then I thought, well, no, it really is a comic book.
I did wonder how you know, whether you saw it in those terms. Obviously, that is how they're marketed, and you can see the comic book influence in them. But clearly, they look very different from some of the other comics that we've talked about as well. I mean, this to me seems to be the equivalent of the big Marvel splash page that we were talking about, where you've got lots of different things going on, but it's all pulled together in one image here.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think they are comics, but I think if I'd set out to make a comic at first, it would have a lot less of the text. I think for me, when I always used to have ideas for comics without any text, whereas for me, this is as close to writing a non-comic as I could get. I mean, it's the first thing that I've ever made where the text has come first. Like I write all the text with lots of descriptions of the illustrations, but this is the first step of each book, and I've never worked like that before. The pictures have always come before. But I think this is as far away from a comic as I can get, but it's still pretty much a comic.
That's interesting. It's something that I'd like to explore when we bring in Sylvie and Jerry as well. Some of those comics, particularly from studios, you'd have the script, wouldn't you, written, and then the pictures would come afterwards. But of course, if you're doing both, you have more freedom to do it in any way that you want. And so I'm interested to find out really how that works for different people. I'm going to bring Sylvie in. Sorry it was so quick. I know there's so much more that we could talk about,
okay.
But you've given us a good flavour there. But let's bring Sylvie in as well. So you've told us that you've already introduced your book a little bit to us, but perhaps in your own words, tell us, where it starts, where it ends up, maybe a little bit of what happens in between.
So I was talking to a friend of mine many years ago, and I said, I used to live in a school, and I went on with whatever I was saying. And she stopped me right there. She said, wait, you lived in a school? So I realized that living in a school is not the most common thing that can happen to someone. And my father was the principal of a small college. It was called École Normale in France. I don't think they make those anymore, but that's where students learn to be student teachers. So that gave me the idea that living in a school could be the start of something. And in the end, I lived in that school from about 10 to 17, maybe a little earlier. And in the end, those years are the years that are covered in my book, Sylvie. There's the years between about when I'm just out of elementary school all the way to the end of high school. And I think those are very formative years. They're years where all kinds of things happen in your brain and in your appreciation of the world. So this turned out to be a book covering many years, which I think is not that common in a memoir for young readers, but people seem to have taken to it. So that's working out. And I, like I said, it was more of a series of anecdotes. And by writing a series of anecdotes, I realized that I was telling a story, and the story was of myself becoming an artist. That's because you can write a story about all kinds of aspects of your life, and I didn't choose necessarily some aspects that I don't want to even mention what they were, but becoming an artist was a big one. Becoming a person who thought for herself was important to me. Relationships with friends and parents are of course there, and homework was a huge thing. Homework was something that to me was a nightmare when I was young. So it has a chapter of its own.
And finding a place of your own.
Absolutely.
Where you could be yourself.
Yeah.
That seems to be a big thing, or at least that's what resonated with me when I was reading it.
Yeah.
Shall we have a look at some of the spreads as well? So I've just realised I have to go through the slides again to pick up. So one of the things that I noticed about your work, Sylvie, was it's really chapters in this memoir,
Right.
and you use colour to denote really the different episodes in this story. They all seem to be tonally connected, but there are different nuances of colour that are used throughout.
Right. So there were so many chapters. I thought, oh, that would be fun to separate the chapters with different color harmonies. And I definitely thought I would adapt the harmony to what the chapter was about. So this one is one of the earliest chapter, and it's so far in my memory. I use a lot of sepia and earth tones in my mind that recalls olden days when photographs were often, not in my time. My time was already a colorful time, but still sepia seems to recall the olden days. So this chapter is all in earth tones, except she has her little blue sweater. And I chose this particular spread because it's one of the spreads where it shows Sylvie really enjoying drawing for one of the earliest time in that little room behind her dad's office, and the availability of drawing material was plentiful. So I was very fortunate that way, and also I enjoyed showing my dad, who I think as I'm getting older, I'm getting more. My dad has passed away many, many years ago. But as I'm getting older, I'm getting more and more fond of the memories I have of my dad. And I realize I am something I never realized before is that I'm very much like him. I thought I was more like my mother because I look like a woman, first of all, and I look like my mother. But I'm very much like my father. And I felt myself really enjoying drawing him in particular. feeling a lot of warmth towards him.
And that comes across, that feels like a very special relationship. So that's probably coming through in your memory as well.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know about the lettering here, because there looks to be some hand lettering. Did you do that at the bottom of the page?
At the bottom of the page, yes. So I have some narration, I have some panels, and I have occasionally a few lines that are written as if the child or Sylvie had written them. And I don't think I put a lot of thought into what would be, because it's all in my voice, right? The narration is also in my voice. So I didn't put a lot of thought of what was going to be handwritten and what was going to be typed. It just seemed to come naturally for me. Maybe I think a big truth to me would end up being handwritten that way. And it created a little bit of a different, like a third aspect of the book, visually.
So here, now this really interests me, because I often see on television programs, whenever they film something in a school, there's always children's art on the wall. It never looks to me as though children have really drawn that art. It looks like an adult's drawn that art, but here you're obviously replicating your earlier artwork.
So I picked this for a couple of reasons. So one of them, like you said, is for the artwork. All along, we see Sylvie's artwork developing from very childlike to a little more advanced. But the artwork was, like you said, replicated. I grew up in a family that moved, and I'm not a keeper myself. So I have absolutely nothing from childhood, drawn from childhood. And those drawings were, for me, one of the most fun thing to do. So I am actually very glad to be able to have, not to have had access to my old work. That's why I was not tempted to search through them and pick through them. And drawing in a childlike way is one of the biggest pleasure I have. So that was a good opportunity to do it. The other reason I picked this spread, and I realized I sent you accidentally spreads where there were still some comments before publishing, like in pink, there's still comments on nitpicking on of my own on the way the words were put in the bubble. So we have to ignore that. But I really appreciate graphic novel ability to show easily what the characters think. And this is done through a speech bubble, but with little bubbles going to the head instead of a tail going to the head. A couple of other ways to do it. And I think, to me, that's one of the most attractive way of telling a story, because I'm particularly interested in what people think and what people feel. And I think sometimes the facial expression, the attitude, does not necessarily reflect what we think and feel. So that was a great opportunity to show that all along.
And it's interesting, because I think that works particularly well in the graphic novel form. It always feels a little bit more false when you do it in prose narrative. It always seems to be one step removed, whereas here it's coming straight from the head. So it's very, more direct, I think.
Very immediate. That's very true. Yeah, yeah. I picked, maybe you wanted to say something first about this?
No, I thought that you left the bubbles in the comments in deliberately. I was fascinated by that. I thought, that's really interesting.
So I picked this particular spread because another aspect of graphic novel, which I find very appealing, is that you don't even have to describe what the characters are doing. There is absolutely no mention here that the mother is sewing and Sylvie's ironing. The actual interest of this double spread is the conversation between the two characters. And not only the conversation, but that even at some point what Sylvie is thinking, which is not what her mother is thinking, obviously. But I like to be able, all through the book, to show some of the things that may have been even a little different from an American upbringing. I didn't want to say it was different for me then than it is for you American kids here. I didn't want to say that at all. I just wanted to say it as if I had just come out of my own childhood. And the pictures enabled me to show that one of my activities on a regular basis was ironing the whole laundry of the laundry of the whole family. And it happened all the time. And I don't think people iron the way I used to iron, or certainly not iron everything. So I did enjoy picturing things like that. At some point, I know that the mother is making a soup in the background, and nowhere in the text does it say mom is making a soup with leeks. But it's particularly French to have your vegetable soup in the evening. And so I was able to sneak in those little French habits through the pictures without pointing to them with words.
Love it.
This is, I enjoyed this one. I think I enjoyed this one because it's one where I have maybe the most panels in the page, especially on the page on the right. I wanted to squeeze in a lot of panels because there was a conversation between me and a friend. And it includes some thinking, which comes through the bubble. It includes the conversation. It includes narration, and I think I also enjoyed the harmony of this one, just in those earthy tones again that came back at some point.
So the harmony of the tones, or the overall look of the pet, that just the unity of it.
Right. The unity, the monochromatic look, even though it's not at all monochromatic, it has a sense of that it's more or less in earthy tones. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that is okay. And
sorry.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine with this one because you don't have, oh my goodness, the time goes by. This one allowed me to have thought panels, thought bubbles, but instead of putting words in the thought bubbles, I put images in them. And that was a little bit different way also of expressing what the character is thinking, but without words. And here, Sylvie is just complete fantasy. And Sylvie has reached the age of about 15, 16, where you are, or I was, thinking a lot of romance. And romance was on my mind, and daydreaming about possible romance was ever present. And it seemed like it could happen at any turn of the road. So here she's taking Sylvie. I'm going to say Sylvie. Sylvie's taking a walk through the forest and daydreaming about meeting someone, which of course she would not. If she met someone in the forest, she would probably run away. But in her dreams, she's thinking of how wonderful it would be. And of course, the next scene is going to be a surprise that it's not at all what she's encountering. So that was kind of funny. And I'm not going to say because people are going to have to read the book to find out what happens when the daydream is rudely interrupted.
And of course, those shapes are much more dreamy than the rectangles and the squares that most of your images are in. And that's Jerry's. So let's bring Jerry in, and we'll come together briefly at the end, Sylvie, to look at some connections between all of them. Jerry, thank you for hanging on in there while we were chatting. I hope that was of some interest to see.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm interested to know, before we get into School Trip, you are a syndicated cartoonist, and I don't know what that means, so I knew I wanted to ask you what one of those was.
Yeah, I did a comic strip for about 20 years called Mama's Boys that was syndicated by King Features, meaning that they took it and they sent it to different newspapers around the country. So some of them are syndicated daily, like how Peanuts, with Charlie Brown was, and then mine, in my case, was syndicated weekly. So we go out to different newspapers each week.
Mm. So I have huge admiration for cartoonists who do that daily or that weekly cartoon. I know the pressure that there is to get that just right. I think it's one of the top skills in writing, drawing, because you have very limited amount of space, and you have to get that right. You have to not miss a beat on the last frame. Phew, do you feel that pressure?
Well, you know what? It actually helped me doing New Kid in the graphic novels, because for years it was, panel, panel, joke, panel,
Mm.
panel, joke. So I'm trained to put so many jokes in that I don't go too many panels without there being something funny, whether it's visual or whether it's a punchline, or in some
Mm.
cases, a really bad dad joke.
That's allowed. So tell us a bit about School Trip. It's the third book, as we've said, in this series.
Right. So it all began with the first one, which is New Kid, and it basically follows a kid named Jordan Banks who's 12 years old, and he wants to be an artist. His mom and dad don't want him to go to art school, so they send him to a prestigious private school in the Riverdale section of New York City. So that's the seventh grade. In the companion book, Class Act, it's still Jordan, but it focuses on a little bit more of Drew and his other friend Liam, and it is most of their eighth grade year from September until about April. So that's their eighth grade year. And in both books, they kind of allude to maybe going on a trip to Paris towards the end of eighth grade. So with School Trip, which came out April 5th, this is the culmination of that. So this is Drew and Jordan and Liam and their other classmates who you've met in the first two books actually take a trip to Paris. So you see behind me here, this is the main three uh, in front of the Eiffel Tower. So
Mm.
learning about the culture, because I wanted it to be where now they were all kind of the new kid. So it wasn't just Jordan who felt uncomfortable. They all kind of did, because they didn't necessarily speak the language or know the culture or the customs.
Mm. Paris is a bit of a connection. I got deliberately lost in Paris when I was 17. The teachers must have been terrified. I turned up at 10 o'clock that night at the hotel, having
Wow.
deliberately gone on the train going in the wrong direction. I mean, isn't that a terrible thing to do with your teacher, to
Yeah.
your teachers? But, I learned about Paris in ways that I wouldn't have done. So let's have a look at... sorry, I've got to go through these again, but we're going to get there now.
Mhm.
Why Paris, Jerry? Was there any particular reason for choosing Paris?
You
Obviously, the
know,
art, I guess.
yeah. As an artist, for Jordan to go to, the Louvre. Well, I went maybe 5 years ago with a bunch of artists, and that was really when I got the idea for it. And for a young artist to go to the Picasso Museum and the Louvre and some of the other just amazing museums and galleries, I thought was the uh, probably the high point of his young artist career.
Mm, wonderful. Tell us a bit about this spread. We've got the metro.
Did you pull it up?
Oh, it would help, wouldn't it?
Yeah, otherwise I'd have to be really descriptive.
There we go.
Yeah, so basically, I went twice, once with my friend, and then I took my two sons who were in their early 20s. And, just showing the differences. And I like the movement of the pages. So this is just waiting for the metro, on the metro itself, having discussions, getting off, and just really, I took so much footage while I was out there, so many videos and still shots. And then I like at the end how they're actually coming out of the metro. But if I have, like, on the left side where there are a lot of establishing shots where the characters are much smaller, then
Mm,
on the right side, I like to have at least one big close up. So you see that's Andy's face. Um, and then I like to use a lot of white space also. So I don't think that bottom right panel would have looked the same if I continued the panel all the way to the edge. I just really liked having the word balloons hanging out in the gutter in the white space,
mm,
and then I just think it adds for a cleaner shot.
Mm. And you're using a lot of filmic language as you're talking, a cleaner shot and establishing shot. Do we use the same terminology when we're talking about creating these kinds of pictures as we do with a film?
Yeah, I guess I've always been a big movie buff, and there are websites that I looked at a few years ago that really broke down some major films, kind of shot by shot, where you could see it as a director. So I do think in terms of a cinematic thing of
Mm.
like how it pans, and
Mm.
I almost wanted to get too fancy and kind of like blur out the background in some scenes, but they had to rein me back in. They're like, okay, wait a second now, you didn't do that in book one, you can't do that in book two and three.
I'm interested in, the sort of readability, whether that's something you have to consider with, say, your speech balloons, your speech
Mhm.
bubbles, because when this doesn't work, um, is when a reader doesn't know which order to read things in. So what you've got here is you're linking through. So there's not going to be any mistake here in terms of reading things in the right order, because they do need to be read in a
Yeah,
particular order.
absolutely. If you don't read it and can't make sense of it, then I've not done my job. So whenever I can link them, I do, or else it is a definite left to right, or up and down, so that and that's why I think that a lot of older teachers back in the day shut down, because they were just confused and they didn't know what to do, and then they got frustrated, and then they just said, oh, this is beneath us, so
Mhm.
it's not, we don't want our kids reading this stuff because it doesn't make any sense.
So I was going to ask, that idea that Thomas mentioned, that you've got your script first and then you fit that to the pictures. Is that how it works? It looks really complex to me because there's a lot of words and you are limited to exactly what you can get on this page. So is that just experience? You know roughly what you can get on a page and do it intuitively, or does it need very, very careful planning?
A little of both. It definitely, the more you do it, the easier it gets. But I know initially I kind of sketched it out and wrote it at the same time by doing like quick thumbnails, because I can't wait to start drawing. But since this is the culmination of all three books, this is the first one that I literally wrote out as a script, because I wanted to make sure that I did not forget anything. So I felt like I had more control writing it out, as opposed to if I had done it the way I had done the other ones. And then the worst thing is to, end the series and someone goes, oh, I really thought that they would tie up that loose end with Maury or with Alexandra. And you're like, oh man, that's right. So this one, I really wrote as a script. And every time I thought about something, or if I went online and read something that someone wanted to see happen, I would go back and make a notation so that I made sure that I put it in at the right place.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Oh, now you get all the beauty of the Sacre-Cœur here with this. Apologies, Sylvie, for my French accent.
Yeah, this is just something that it's a double page spread. So that's 2 pages, so it does fold, but
Mm,
I made sure that nothing important goes in the fold line. So that's why I broke up the characters the way that I did, broke up the panels. And I just wanted to show the awe on the kids' faces, as well as seeing the basilica itself. And I thought that this is the best way to do it. And you really didn't need the balloons coming out of their mouths. So I just tried something a little different, you know, so you could read it, so you know that all the kids are there. You see this amazing view. And, my colorist, in this case, Dershing Helma, I do a lot of the basic coloring, and then I hand it off to the experts. So
mm,
Dershing Helma just, I mean, look at what she did with the clouds and the trees and the shadowing and things like that. So this is one
Mm.
that I was very proud of.
Interesting. Wonderful composition. And I love the fact that those faces of, they're facing away from the way they would really be facing, but we get to see both of those things at once. I just think that's
Right. Because
brilliant.
otherwise I would have had to draw the backs of their heads,
Yeah.
which wouldn't have had the same kind of emotional impact.
No, it's great. So,
So this is showing the Louvre, and just how massive it is. And from an American perspective, I mean, these are things that you just only see on TV. You always see the Pyramid of the Louvre, you see Sacre Coeur, you see the Seine River, you see uh, the Arc, and so to actually put a name to these, because sometimes it's just in like the B-roll, we're watching the show and you always see it, but a kid may not necessarily know what it is, and yeah, exactly what it is. So I wanted to really add some context to it so you could really get a sense of where these kids are going and feel like
mm.
you're there on the trip with them.
You mentioned that you have a colorist. Do you have to give direction to a colorist, or do you leave it entirely to them?
Um, you know, it really depends on the colorist. In this one, we worked really well together because it has to fit my art style. You know, mine is sort of in between. It's not very simplistic. Like I like the highlights and the shadows, but it's not as complex as like like the Amulet series,
Right.
where every panel is just like an amazing piece of artwork. Because I do want the characters sort of simplified. They're not wimpy kid, but they're not realistic either.
Mm.
So I like that real middle ground. And
Mm.
in this case, the colorist, didn't do anything that was distracting. So even like the one where Jordan on the right side is giving a thumbs down, there's just a little gradation in the background. So I chose not to put, 1,000 people online in every panel because it can be overwhelming, and especially for young readers. I remember how I used to just see a lot of stuff and just be overwhelmed and just sort of like, lose my focus on what I should have been looking at.
Mm. So,
Um, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
same one with this.
sorry.
And I love how the colorist distinctively did the warm colors on the left side and the cooler to show the nighttime. And again, since I wasn't a reader necessarily as a kid, whenever I can do a full page without any words, I feel that there is some kid somewhere thanking me for it. So I have this nice shades of blue, and all that is the click and then the smiley face. Like if I can do something with a question mark or a smiley face or something like that, or a facial
Mm.
expression, as opposed to saying, "Hey, what's going on there? Why did you open the door? Are you inviting me in? Hey, Andy, come on in." You
Mm.
know, I don't need all of that, and then you could just really focus on it and kind of immerse yourself.
I love the way as well that, images can evoke a sound. I mean, you've obviously included one word here, click, but
Hmm.
people often think of his images as being silent or quiet, but actually there's
Right.
quite a lot of noise in a picture, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And then
Lovely.
this one I like because so the one on the left, the full page spread, again, if I had broken that up into panels, like 6 panels, um, it could have looked very wordy. and because I know that there was a lot to say. So to balance the fact that there is a lot of words, I just give you one picture to look at. So a kid isn't going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then to make it even easier, I added a slight bluish tint to the panels that Kirk, who's wearing all black, is speaking. So it adds that little bit of extra delineation so you know which character is talking.
So clever. And again, it's so considerate of the reader, I think. That's what I would say. So I think that was your last picture, Jerry. I'm going to bring everybody else back in, and we'll just have a few minutes to round up. I don't know how often you get the chance to hear other creators of graphic novels talking about their work. I've certainly found it absolutely engrossing, fascinating. Can I just ask you, Sylvie, before we go to any general comments or questions that you have, do you do your own colouring?
Yes, that's all mine. Yeah.
Interesting. Great.
I haven't been offered any kind of colorist, so that's just how it is, but I enjoy doing it.
I guess the history behind the kind of work that you do is different as well, and so that kind of expectation, I think, if Jerry's actually coming from a cartooning and that sort of background, maybe it's different. So
I come from a picture book background, so yes, that is true. Although I am embracing the graphic novel format full-heartedly right now, so that's going to be my thing too.
I'm looking forward to seeing if we get the next bit of Sylvie's life in graphic novel format. I'm just waiting to see. What did you take away from listening to each other talking?
I want to know if Thomas finds a big difference in doing the pixelated video game world and the realistic. Is one more fun for you? Is one more difficult?
The pixelated stuff is really, really hard to do. It's really tight. Everything's done by hand, so like every sharp edge is made using an eraser on a blunt line. So in terms of it being a challenge, the most of the book is set in the game world. And the lion's share of the time is based on doing that artwork. So I'm always kind of a little bit relieved when I get to a scene with Sunny, because it's just a smooth line, whereas Super Rabbit Boy, you have to etch your way along. So, but I do enjoy as well the challenge. Like, I'm a fool for creating these problems for myself, but I do enjoy having the mix of styles. I think and definitely because I still do illustrate the Pamela Butchart books, when I shift over to those, they're a very different style. And so I do enjoy not having just one sort of way of working.
Mm-hmm. And Sylvie, can I just ask you again something that we didn't touch on, but how are your images rendered? I'm guessing you don't use a tablet, but I could be wrong.
I do. I have found I'm using Procreate on an iPad, and then transferring that to Photoshop for finishing touches and adding text and such things. I have really enjoyed working on the tablet because of the ability to move things around. It would have taken me a lot longer to do things by hand, but it was my first book done digitally, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Because that's the other thing, they take a long time, don't they? To put these books together.
Yes, and I think the for me anyway, the biggest part of the work is not what's showing on the book. It was all the putting it together and finding the scenes and deleting hundreds of pages and things like that. So it does take a long time, but what a reward at the end, that's for sure.
Was there anything that you heard from either Jerry or Thomas that particularly piqued your interest?
Well, not necessarily what I heard, but I wanted to say something to Thomas, is that I'm not a gamer, and I really enjoyed reading a few of your books, but my partner likes to play games, and she often talks about how they seem to be fun, but they're actually they teach kids how to problem solve. So she really believes in the educational value of them. And one thing I appreciated in your book is that the parents are completely into what the kids are doing. I remember at the end of one, the father says, "Good job," when the kid has finished his game. And I thought, oh, that's a nice touch, and it's a little different. So I just wanted to mention that detail, which I thought charming.
Oh, thank you. I mean, my mum and dad always took an interest in what I was doing, and I used to play Mario Kart a lot with my mum, so they definitely were aware of what I was doing. But I'm actually not very good at video games, so I tried to get in the books as much as the kid not being able to do stuff as possible, which kind of adds to the journey, I guess.
Yeah.
I used to sit in this chair side by side with my 10-year-old son playing games, video game. Well, mainly ours were Mist-driven, you know, those kinds of puzzle and adventure. And now he designs them. So
Wow.
something good must have gone on there at that time. Thomas, anything that you heard that, you know, interested you?
Well, it was really interesting to hear Jerry talking about the process of the decision making. Like, that was fascinating to see why he chose to do this and that. And I wondered, like, did his years of being a syndicated cartoonist kind of add to that skill set? When you moved to doing more graphic novels, did he have to learn a whole new set of skills?
You know what? I actually worked with a woman named Barbara Slate years ago, and I did backgrounds for the comics that she did. So we did some New Kids on the Block comic books, and there was a series called Sweet 16. And then she went on to do, you know, Barbie and just a bunch of different things. So that whole, like, you know, establishing shot and then the big close up and push pull was really ingrained in my brain. So now it's almost second nature.
Well, I've taken a lot of your time today, of which I'm incredibly appreciative. Thank you all so much for taking us a little bit deeper into your world of the form of graphic novels. I can't wait to see what each of you does next. Thomas, I know we've got plenty more books to come in this series in the UK. Jerry, you've got to the end of this is a trilogy, really, isn't it?
Yep.
So another
scratch.
another graphic novel coming after that, or do we not know?
Yeah, I'm gonna do a whole new series, another set of 3.
Brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And Sylvie?
My next one will be a graphic novel, but it's not going to be a memoir. It's going to be a chapter. You would call it a chapter book for a little bit younger readers than my memoir. Yeah.
And Thomas, I didn't mean to just say, and you've got lots more coming out. Do you have another series as well, or anything else that we can be looking out for?
Not at the minute. This is keeping me busy enough as it is. I've just finished a special edition, which will be book 14, which is a choose your own adventure style book. So it's the same series, but this time the kids get to play the video game through the book. So I'm just finishing up that one, but there'll be more press start after that.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So